Welcome to the Soul of Enterprise, Business in the Knowledge Economy, sponsored by Woodard, building your ideal practice with coaching, education, community, and resources. I'm Ed Kless with my good friend and co-host Ron Baker, and folks, on today's show, we have our second interview with Jordan Birnbaum. Hey, Ron, how's it going?
Yeah, it's going great. I'm looking forward to this. Get to talk some behavioral economics.
Yeah, always, it's always a fun topic to talk about. So let me read Jordan in. This is his second time on, but things have changed for him, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Jordan Birnbaum is an industrial/organizational psychologist, applied behavioral scientist, and serial entrepreneur specializing in leadership, motivation, organizational design, product design, sales, marketing, UX, which is user experience, HR and HR technology. He is the CEO of Glinda Group, a firm dedicated to enhancing employee, customer, and prospect engagement through applied social science. He previously served as the vice president and chief behavioral economist at ADP, where he directed the application of economic principles to new product development in the human capital management market. He is also, we talked about this the last time, so you can look this up on the show, owned and operated the Vanguard in Los Angeles, a renowned music and entertainment venue. Welcome back to the Soul of Enterprise, Jordan Birnbaum.
Thank you so much. What a delight and pleasure. I'm so happy to see you both and can't wait to dig into it today.
Yeah, so as I said, a lot has changed. You're back on your own. You're back doing the entrepreneurial thing, which is fantastic. Ron and I love that. Tell me about Glinda Group.
Okay, it's really exciting. And in fact, there's a correction to be made. I am not the CEO of Glinda Group.
Okay.
In fact, I recruited the CEO of Glinda Group.
While
I was at ADP. I had built with an amazing team a product called Compass, which had some great success with leadership development. And around the same time, ADP acquired the Marcus Buckingham Company, which had a different but related product called Standout. And when that acquisition was final, I met one of my new colleagues at the Marcus Buckingham Company, a woman named Laura Martin. And even though we were in sort of a tricky professional situation, we ended up striking an incredible friendship and supported each other's products for the next several years in one of the most effective collaborations I'd ever had. And so fast forward a few years later, and I'm back to being a consultant. ADP is one of my anchor clients, happily. It's always a good thing when your former employer brings you back as a consultant. You didn't pick off anybody, thankfully. And I was having fun, but also realizing that there were elements of the job that I wasn't loving and also kind of missed the camaraderie of a team. And I thought about who would be the right person to partner with. And just Laura came directly to mind. At this point, she was the CHRO for the second largest reinsurance brokerage in the world. Actually, they're headquartered out of London. And so she was doing great, but I don't think she had the same kind of passion as the kind of work that we're doing now. So I called her up and I made the pitch that she should quit her job and come start this new company with me. And she agreed. And I'll share the story of the name and then shut up for a moment. But we were in one of our first meetings, and when she was explaining why she was excited to work with me, she talked about Compass, and she said, you know, I've seen you use behavioral science to affect people in positive ways that you've never met before. You're like a wizard, but for good. And I was like, yeah, like Glinda, I'm a good witch. And we just sort of both laughed. And she said, you know that Wicked is my favorite musical. And my wife is downstairs and it's her favorite musical. She's seen it like 7 times. It's, you know, several months before the movie came out. And it was just like, well, that's who we are, I suppose. And the Glinda Group was born in that moment. And I have to say, the name has been, it's a pretty big hit. Like, we're getting a lot of love for it. So delighted that it's sending out the kind of message that we want. It's conveying the emotions that we want it to.
And of course, that's actually the Glinda from the original Wizard of Oz, because the Glinda from Wicked, this could be a little sketchy there.
Well, it could be Galinda, could be Glinda. It depends on at what point in the story you're picking it up.
Absolutely correct.
We'll take either.
Yeah,
they're both good in our book.
I'm a big fan as well. I think it's got some of the most clever lyrics that has ever been written on Broadway. And he's one of the few that does a great job when, this is Stephen Schwartz, the author, well, when he writes music and lyrics together, it's something special. Because most Broadway, it's usually a team. So there are very limited people who do it solo. Anyway, we're not going to
also add to that the hits in Wicked musically are more complicated than any other that I've heard. So Defying Gravity is not a typical song. It doesn't have the usual, sort of fallback 4/4 into 3/4 or whatever it might be. It's really a work of art.
Yeah, no, it is. Some really incredible chord progressions as well. But that was not the purpose of our call, however interesting that is. I'm going to jump right out and say, I think since we last talked, there has been let's call it a challenge to behavioral economics. There was some situation with one of the founding fathers, if you will, of behavioral economics, Daniel Ariely, and some maybe perhaps faking of data or massaging of data. Let's address that from the get-go.
Yeah, so it's a great call out. One of the things that I've really kind of gotten comfortable with over the years is that the term behavioral economics did not exist during the Milgram experiments, but that was behavioral economics. And the term behavioral economics did not exist during the 1950s advertising boom as portrayed in Mad Men, but that was behavioral science. And so one of the things that I think has happened is it's always been social psychology. Since the late 1800s in Germany, we're always talking about social psychology. There's clinical psychology, which is going in, social psychology, which is how we all affect each other and how we interact with our environments and each other. So I think that were we to evaluate the state of the field, we would have to go back and say, all right, well, things look pretty bleak when Zimbardo was doing his stuff with the Stanford prison experiment. And you will not have a hard time going through any period where you will find bad actors that have gone for the easy hit and taken a shortcut. Now, I don't know anything about the specifics of the most recent allegations, so I don't want to say that I have an opinion one way or the other about where those will land. But I think that when you take a step back and you look at the entirety of social psychology, then what's happening right now is not so atypical.
Well, have been quoted exactly once in Harvard Business Review. I don't know if I told you the story last, exactly once. And it's
10 more times, then I'll be happy. Go ahead.
And the sentence is, business ain't science. That's it.
There you go.
That's my only ever quote in Harvard Business Review. So I'll take that. But and I think that's the same thing. We call it behavioral science, but I think when you really think about it, it's using science in an older notion of that term. It's really about behavioral knowledge of human behavior, not science as in totally causal effect that if you see this blue dot, you're going to buy this pair of pants.
Precisely right. And there's another thing, a point that I love to make whenever I'm lecturing on behavioral science that I think actually really sort of adds some weight to what you just said. Whenever I teach any behavioral principle, nobody is ever like, really? I had no idea. Everyone's reaction to everything is always like, oh yeah. We are all expert at behavioral science because we've been experimenting with it since we're kids. Now, the thing is that we all use things like loss aversion or psychological reactance. We use these things, but unconsciously, and we just don't happen to know the names. And so whenever I'm teaching people about behavioral science, what I've come to learn is I'm not teaching them anything that they haven't been doing their entire life. I just teach them the names of things. The reason that that is so powerful, of course, is that you can't do something on purpose unless you know the name. And so that's why it is worth it to learn the names of these things that we've been doing unconsciously our whole lives, because it provides a level of intentionality that makes us significantly more effective.
And I think because I think so many people think that marketing is just purely about manipulation, and people say, well, we have these big companies and all they do is manipulate into buying stuff we don't need. Well, don't buy it. Like I don't quite understand the full logic behind that we suddenly just buy stuff that we don't really want because somebody said magic words to us. It really, I think, takes some of the sentience out of the consumer. It's really I'm trying to think up the word. It's like, but it's very patriarchal to think that, right, that people have that much control over other human beings.
I think that's a really incredible point. At the end of the day, we have, I think, much more control over our ultimate decisions and the way that we engage with marketing is really usually who was able to actually reach us, our authentic selves, for the connection rather than some kind of manipulation. I think they actually found us.
And in fact, I had a question about a particular story that I want to ask you about, but since you used the word right now, I want to talk to you about it. I want to hear your definition of authentic or authenticity.
All right. I would like to say that I have a piece called The Irony Bowl, and it's about a fictitious game between the great communicators and the authentic leaders for who could be most ironic. Authenticity, to me, authenticity means being entirely yourself without any regard for others. So it's another way of saying a narcissistic jerk. I'm much more interested in someone who has the capacity to think about how they're treating others and making an effort to be as cordial and productive and positive as they can, as opposed to someone who might be in a bad mood and then decides they want to just expose everyone else to it. Now, other people define authentic in some other way. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I'm a student of Peter Block, and he defines authenticity in a way that it was just being willing to say what you see and feel. That's all he defines it as, being willing to do that, especially in a consulting type relationship where you're. But he also says that it is putting emotions into words in a non-emotional way, right? So it's trying to state emotions as a statement of fact, rather than using emotion to manipulate. Does that make sense?
I support both of those two descriptions. They sound excellent to me. It's just a question of what do we call them?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think it was Plato. Wisdom begins with the definition of terms. So
we're back to names again. So
that's right. We got to start and agree on a definition. Otherwise, we're playing tennis on two different courts. See that all the time. All right, but we're up against our first break. Want to remind our listeners that they can get a hold of Ron or me by sending an email to asktsoe@verisage.com. Of course, the website is The Soul of Enterprise, where you can see show notes as well as previews to upcoming shows. We do have our Patreon channel, so go on, check that out at patreon.com/TSOE. There you can get the show commercial free, as well as listen to the bonus episodes that Ron and I record. Also want to make sure that you can get a shout out at that Patreon channel like Geraldine Carter does for her new community, Peak Freedom. If you want to rise above the insanity of the hustle and culture and simply work less hours while keeping your income, go visit GeraldineCarter.com/peak. But right now, a word from our sponsors.
Welcome back, everybody. We're here with Jordan Birnbaum and we're talking about engagement from the inside out. And Jordan, you have a great blog on Psychology Today where you wrote some articles. I've been marinating in them since last night.
Are you
And
okay?
no, they're really good. I really like them. They're punchy and they're opinionated. I love it. I love it.
Oh, thanks.
One that struck me is it's titled "It's Personal: The Real Source of Business Success," and all I could think, of course, is Godfather. It's not personal; it's business.
Right.
You reverse it. Explain.
What's interesting is that whenever you look at any kind of indication of a business's health, for example, if you want to look at employee engagement or, employee sentiment or customer sentiment, ultimately, the thing that you're always going for is, do people care? Do they take it personally? Literally, employee engagement is the degree to which organizational success matters to the individual. And it literally predicts discretionary effort. And so if people are not feeling personally about your business, they are simply not going to try as hard. If customers don't feel personally about your business, they are not going to be as good or as loyal a customer as you can have. And so the irony is that in every strain of business, we're actually trying to get people to feel very personally about our business, whether it's an employee, a customer, or even just trying to enhance our brand. So it always struck me as just a pretty lame excuse to legitimize antisocial behavior.
Right, by saying it's business, it's not
By saying it's
personal.
business, so therefore I'm going to
Yeah,
act in a totally unjustifiable way,
yeah.
because
It's a
otherwise I couldn't
great point.
justify it. Yeah,
That discretionary effort point is beautiful because, I think of companies like Disney and even FedEx, maybe in the early days more than now, but amazing stories about people, running helicopters to deliver the pack. I mean, that discretionary effort is the X factor that you can't measure. And
exactly.
you talk about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. I'd love for you to break that down because we haven't talked about that in a long time.
Yeah, oh, sure. It's for me, the ultimate example of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation was being 19 years old in college. And do I play another video game or do I get out of bed and go to class? Um, Intrinsic motivation was stay in bed and play the video game because that's what I really wanted to do. Extrinsic motivation was roll out of bed and go to class because that's what I had to do. And so extrinsic motivation is doing something because we have to. And so most of our motivators at work tend to be extrinsic. So I'm going to work hard to get a promotion, or I'm going to work hard to get this bonus, or I'm going to work hard to get some kind of outcome that exists outside of me. Or I'm going to work hard to not get fired.
Fired.
But basically, people are motivated by things that will happen outside of them, which are usually the levers that are easiest for organizations to pull. Intrinsic motivation is I'm doing this because I want to. And I'm doing this because I want to is infinitely more powerful. So when people are intrinsically motivated, they try way harder. So in some ways, the ultimate is can you get people intrinsically motivated at work? And there's actually one leadership theory that proved that you can. It's called self-determination theory by DC and Ryan. And these geniuses discovered that if people had three fundamental needs met at work, they felt so good about life that they were intrinsically motivated to show up and work as hard as they could. And the three needs were autonomy, mastery, and connection. Now, autonomy simply meant that they were free to determine how to achieve their goals. Not that anybody could do whatever they want, just that they had the autonomy to decide how to get it done. So no micromanagement. We all have to feel like we're worth something. So having the opportunity to demonstrate our mastery and to be celebrated for it by our team and by our leader is a really fundamental human need. And then if we are connected with our colleagues, if we have a good morale on our team, good personal dynamics, those are so fundamental to human happiness that when all three of those are met, we're going to show up to work and work as hard as we can just to keep it because we're going to want to protect that thing that we have. And that's the kind of intrinsic motivation. And so I think when you talk about the stories of FedEx employees going to unbelievable lengths to get something done, they're doing it because they want to protect the thing that they love. And the thing that they love is that culture and their coworkers and their colleagues and the ability to have these be the people with whom they go to bat every day. And so if we can find either as leaders of teams or leaders of organizations, a way to fulfill those human needs, the performance we get in return is extraordinary.
You know, and it seems to me, Jordan, that businesses don't seem to understand this. You know, Peter Drucker even wrote about this decades ago, where he said, stop trying to bribe knowledge workers. It doesn't work. They're volunteers. Look at how people work so hard for non-for-profit, where they're not paid or paid very little. Why do you think this lesson isn't better understood?
Gosh, I could go in so many different directions there. I think that oftentimes it's hard to maintain clarity under tremendous pressure. And I think that we're in a professional environment where even the people who are thriving are feeling under immense pressure. Even if you think about Moore's law and the rate of change in technology, and literally everything is changing faster and faster every day because of the size of computer chips and processing power. And so I do think that we're in this sort of spiral of, hitting numbers, constant growth with the world constantly shifting underneath our feet, making that less and less viable. And then the threat of what's the economy going to look like in 5 years with AI, that it's not creating an environment that's conducive to reflection. And so I think a lot of people are just in the hamster wheel right now, and we of course would be we'd be well served to step out and take a moment and take a deep breath.
Excellent. You know, another post you put up was what big business can learn from big sports about human assets. I won't quibble with the violation of the 13th Amendment there. I don't think humans are assets, but that aside, I love your take on this. It was brilliant. I wasn't sure where you were going to go with this, but I love where you went. Explain what big business can learn from sports.
Well, so right now in big business, let's go with the greatest basketball player of all time, Michael Jordan. So if the Chicago Bulls were a corporation, then after Michael Jordan's rookie year, when he showed that extraordinary promise, he would be promoted to the coaching staff. And then 2 seasons after that, he would become an executive. And so because Michael Jordan was the greatest player in the world, the first thing we would do is have him stop playing. And so that was sort of this first understanding that, like, we need to start realizing that our organizations have players and coaches, and we keep taking our best players and turning them into coaches, and taking our best coaches and turning them into players.
Bad players and bad coaches.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we have things complete. One of the things about leaders is leaders need to be patient. Leaders need to have a high tolerance for irrationality. Leaders need to be attuned to emotional realities of the people in their team. The people who are high achievers are the least like that in the world. High achievers have no patience. High achievers don't leave room for emotional realities. Emotions to high achievers are a waste of time. And yet we continue to put high achievers into leadership positions, which, by the way, make them miserable. They hate it. No one is winning here, except that I think the idea, the reason that everybody wants to have a team is because when layoffs happen, they want to make sure they're in the room and are protecting themselves and have a hand in what's going to happen. So if we could just assure Michael Jordan, keep playing, you'll be invited into the room when layoffs are happening, we might then convince them to stay on the floor. And so I think that we need to understand what's really behind the need to lead, and then start realizing that the people who ought to be leading our organizations are the ones who have the most friends. It's about personal dynamics leadership. If you look at the Gallup Q12, the things that drive engagement, it's all human relationships. And so the people who should be in leadership positions ought to be those who excel in human relationships. Strategy and execution are separate from leadership. And if we understand that, then we'll keep our players playing with strategy and execution, and we'll put our people specialists into the leadership positions.
Yeah, it ties perfectly back to your it's personal, not business point.
Exactly.
Let me ask you about the 6 words every worker needs to hear, because I also love this, the difference between status and recognition.
Yeah, status is one of my favorite subjects, and it's actually was just talking with my partner Laura earlier about a tool that we're going to build for it. The 6 words are, and that's why we need you. And what I explain is that the difference between status and recognition is you did something great and I saw it. But status is you're part of this team because you do this. Status looks to the future. It's really about belonging. And that's why when you can say to someone, you did this and that's why we need you, it's not just a statement about what you did in the past, it's a statement about where you belong in the future. And status actually for us is one of the best experiences that we can have. The need for status, we often conflate it with like high society. That's not it at all. Status is literally just belonging. And if we can make sure that everyone on every team feels like they belong there, then the likelihood of them being intrinsically motivated to give their best to protect that status goes way up. And so if leaders can think about shifting from, hey, you did a really good job with that, to, or here's a tangible example. Rather than saying, hey, you contributed in lots of great ways in that project, you can say, hey, you're this team's Swiss Army knife.
Yeah. The other point I really liked about that is you say it's also status leads to storytelling, you know? That's excellent. I just love that. It's a great point. Unfortunately, Jordan, we're up against our first break, or second break actually. And folks, I'd like to remind you, if you want to contact me or Ed, send us an email to asktsoe@verisage.com. And now a word from our sponsors.
And we are back with Jordan Birnbaum of the Glinda Group. Jordan, I want to just pick up on a couple things that you and Ron were talking about, especially the whole sports analogy. And I really like that article too. Are you aware that Babe Ruth, perhaps the greatest baseball player that ever lived, died heartbroken because no one would hire him as a manager? He desperately wanted to be a manager. The best he got was he was a coach for the Brooklyn Dodgers. And when their manager left, they did not promote him, and he was devastated. And someone said to him, "Babe, you can't manage yourself. How are you going to manage a team?"
Oh, that's pretty funny.
but he really thought that, that he should have been given that ability to move into management. But he was terrible. Barry Bonds would be a terrible manager. Wayne Gretzky was a horrible coach.
There's an economic study right here. I bet you that you'll find the best coaches were the mediocre players.
Absolutely. I was going to say Phil Jackson, right? Mike Krzyzewski in basketball. All these guys were solid players. They were fun, but Gretzky can't say skate to where the puck is going to be like I did.
And Jordan can't tell people to compete the way that he did. Or
Right.
Kobe. They
Right.
can't reach people. Magic Johnson wasn't able to coach because he just couldn't reach folks. It's very interesting, but it again, I think that if you dive into the team dynamics in any sport, really from little league to the pros, there is so much insight into the human condition, how we interact with each other, how we can be each other's best friends or worst enemies, and it's really compelling.
Yeah, and worse. And you were talking about this with Ron, that you can't. It is unheard of that you have somebody who's a subordinate make more money than a superior,
Right?
except in sports.
Exactly, where the organizations tend to be, measured as ruthlessly as possible.
Yeah, and the players make the most money.
Exactly.
So let's talk a little bit about this article. It's called "Building the Cognitive Budget for Your Most Effective Mind." First, you got to define for folks, what do you mean when you say cognitive budget?
So I found an exercise through listening to some podcasts and then some tinkering of my own, in which I was able to sort of plot out the things that I thought were really healthy for me to think about and the things that I thought were really unhealthy for me to think about. And so I was trying to consider that I only have a set amount of mental energy per day. And I realized that where it was getting spent, I felt like I was just sort of letting it happen. And whether or not it was being spent on the right things, it just didn't feel intentional to me. And so the idea of the cognitive budget was specifically to try to remind myself that when my mind was wondering, where do I want it to go? What are useful things for me to think about? And not necessarily happy things. Like sometimes you need to confront something that's going very wrong in your life and you need to force yourself to reflect on it. But I found that the more that I was intentional in writing down what I wanted, the better I was able to execute it in my life. And the most important way that it affected me was that it stopped my rumination. So rumination, I think, is an under-discussed problem for most people. Rumination is the process of thinking negatively in circles with no off-ramp, where you're no longer gaining anything of value by thinking about it. I can tell you that I would be, as recently as 5 years ago, down in the basement playing with my dog and thinking about things that I did in high school that I was ashamed of. There's no value there. That's just to make myself feel bad. And I actually heard about rumination as a field of study on a podcast called Hidden Brain, which is wonderful. And it got me to start thinking about my own rumination. And I realized I would ruminate about the same set of things all the time. And so I wrote them down. And what I found happening was that I still would ruminate, but I would catch myself as soon as I did it. And since I had written them down, it was just really easy to spot. And then I had said, hey, you decided that there was no point in doing this, so stop it. And eventually I was able to stop it. And now I don't ruminate anymore. And so it was an extraordinary change in my lived experience. But then that also led me to understanding, well, the opposite of rumination is reflection. So if I'm going to first stop spending on the bad stuff, now what's the good stuff? And then I thought, now I need to figure out what are the things that I will really benefit by reflecting on.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen the Bob Newhart clip that he did called "Stop It"? where
No, tell me.
you do have to. Bob Newhart plays a psychiatrist. Go
Yeah.
figure. And it's a little skit thing in one of the shows, and he has this woman come in who says that she has a fear of being buried alive in a box, and she thinks about it all the time. And he says, "Stop it." That's STOP, new word IT.
If only it was that simple.
That's right, but it's actually,
But maybe it is.
Maybe it is that simple, but it's interesting that you talk about this cognitive budget. I stumbled on the same concept a number of years ago, and I called it emotional capacity. Right? What's your emotional capacity? And in another podcast, which I cannot remember the name of, it was not the same as you do. They talked about the same thing. I'm like, this must be a thing, but it was interesting. They said, you know what? There was a very quaint notion in Victorian era that they had this. It was called willpower.
Yeah.
Right? It's simply
Right.
called willpower, and what you find is that you have more willpower at the beginning of the day than you do at the end. This is why when all of us are dieting, we're like, hey, no problem. I can have a very healthy breakfast and eat lunch, and then you stand there at 10 o'clock at night shoving your face full of Oreos.
Exactly right. That's incredibly true. In fact, I think that there have been findings that judges hand down harsher sentences right before lunchtime and at the end of the day because they're hungry and tired.
One of the things said that the New York Times made a conscious effort not to conduct meetings where decisions were made after lunch.
That's really smart.
They conduct the meetings need to be where decisions are made need to be conducted in the morning. We can have meetings where we share information but if a decision needs to be made, it should be done in the morning, which right. I think is wow.
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about this, because you've got like a deeper process here. I thought it was really fascinating, and you'd have a 2x2, which is fantastic. So proactive, reactive, work, and personal. So talk a little bit more about that.
So, right, once I realized that by identifying my sources of rumination, I could stop them, and that by identifying the things that I wanted to reflect on, I could more easily direct my energy there, then you pretty soon realize that there are two gigantic parts of your life, and they have to exist separately. And one is work, and the other is everything else. And at work, you have to think about, well, what's going to be healthy for me to reflect on for myself and for me to avoid in terms of rumination. I mean, I'm sure most people have experienced this, going home from work and being really super concerned that they said something terrible in a meeting and circling in their minds about how it's going to ruin their career, and then invariably nothing ever happens, but we keep doing it to ourselves over and over again. And so that would be an example of ruminating in a professional capacity, whereas my story about thinking about things that I was ashamed of from high school while playing with my dog is in my personal life. So it really, when you think about where do I want my energy to go and where do I want it to not go, it's very relevant in your personal life. It's very relevant in your professional life. And then if you're a manager, you have a third level where now you have to think about all the people on your team. And so, one of the most important things as a leader is just to make sure that you don't lose sight of your first job, which is to make sure that everybody in your team is doing okay. And it's really easy to get caught up because we overburden leaders with impossible tasks and to-do lists, that it's really difficult for them to find the space, time, or even energy to check in with everyone on the team. But if they don't, that's when things will start to get away from them. And so even in that regard, they can use a cognitive budget just to make sure that as they're going through the week, they're like, okay, have I checked in with each person? And can take a note to them, I know that each person cares about X, Y, or Z. Have I done something this week to show them that I'm paying attention to what they care about?
And you even suggest like coming up with a list of like, here's what I have to do for all of these different folks on a weekly basis and list it out. So maybe give an example of that.
So, there are some people on a team who are going to be really turned on by recognition and feel really energized by it. Other people are going to really love being given a challenging development project and feel really seen and cared about. Other people want to be included in meetings. Other people want to be given sort of a social role within the group. That's how they feel at their best. And so if a manager is able to understand what's the one thing that matters the most to each person on their team, and just sort of keep a little list and remind themselves, hey, each week, if I could do this one little thing for each person on my team, that in and of itself will demonstrate a commitment to them that is going to go a long way towards keeping them engaged and keeping them caring. And in the impossible calendars of most leaders, the hope would be that we can identify a little thing that doesn't take a lot of time, but even just a 2-minute check-in around the right thing, or providing the right opportunities in the right directions are ways to do it.
But Jordan, I want the 5 steps that I do for everyone. I don't, I don't. I don't want to. I don't have to go through this like on an individual basis. I just, there's this 5. I just need a checklist, Jordan.
When the robots come, it'll be much easier.
Is because what I'm hearing you saying is crazy. Treat people as individuals.
Yes, exactly right. We have to actually address their humanity if we want them to care.
As an individual, not as a group, not part of their group identity, as an individual for them in this particular situation.
That's exactly right. And that's what makes the world go round.
Yeah.
And our organizations and business. And ultimately we are all still totally dependent on one another to transact. And one of the things that I actually think is funny, thinking about AI replacing all our jobs, is, okay, well, if that happens, then who's going to buy anything? So is AI going to start selling to AI? It'll be interesting to watch.
There may be transactions in AI, but that's a whole different thing. So this has been great, Jordan. Can't wait to hear your rest of the segment with Ron. But we want to let people know they can get a hold of Ron or me by sending an email to asktsoe@verisage.com. The website, again, is The Soul of Enterprise. We do have the Patreon channel, patreon.com/TSOE. But right now, a word from our sponsor, including Woodard.
Well, welcome back, everybody. We're here with Jordan Birnbaum from the Glinda Group. And Jordan, and this one, man, I was on my desk cheering. Your article, Why HR Can't Work. Man, I can't tell. I hate HR.
Yeah.
I think it's the most destructive function. I think it's administrative, not strategic.
Yeah.
You point out it was born in World War One,
Yep.
which is kind of interesting
Yep.
because I think the annual appraisal, which comes from behavioral psychologists, was born around the same time. You know, the presenting problem.
Yep.
Talk to me about why HR can't work in archetypes, because I love this take on it.
Yeah. So it's interesting. When I was working on Compass back at ADP, and we were really coming up against, is the purpose here to evaluate someone's performance or to support it? And it was just so telling how different the two approaches would be. And it really kind of felt like one was a guidance counselor and the other was a dean of students. One was there to sort of build you up and do whatever they could to um, set you up for success moving forward. And the other one was there to make sure like there will be consequences if you screw up. And of course, nowhere was the dean of students also the guidance counselor, because those two personas are totally at odds with each other and they cancel each other out. And that's exactly what HR is. HR is both the dean of students and the guidance counselor simultaneously, which is why they don't get taken seriously as either. And it is so unfortunate because the majority of HR practitioners are actually great and they have their hands and feet tied behind their backs. And it's really frustrating to watch, especially when I think there are relatively simple solutions.
Like splitting them up, like you say, make these things different functions. I love the counselor
Exactly.
and group, you know, the dean of students and the guidance counselor archetypes. It reminds me. I mean, HR, they seem to want. They remind me of the Stasi. They have a little dossier on everybody with all your annual performance appraisals, which has got to be the biggest waste of time that I've ever seen in my life. Have you found, especially larger organizations, because Ed and I try and keep a list of them, that have ditched the annual performance appraisal?
So there was a move towards this a while back, and then they discovered that it was actually creating even more chaos. And so, I think that the most progressive moves now are more like quarterly or weekly or monthly, where it's not such a big lift, and just trying to make it um, so that there is some sense of performance that's being conveyed across, 4 times a year instead of once a year. So not such a big lift, and also to keep it small enough that it's manageable.
Mm-hmm.
And also maybe make it less susceptible to recency bias, which, when you do a performance evaluation every 12 months, you're really just evaluating every November, and everything else gets forgotten. So there are some moves towards it. I think that what's interesting about a performance review is that we're still unclear what it is that we're trying to accomplish with it. And like HR, trying to do two contradictory things simultaneously makes sure that it doesn't work. So if the performance appraisal is to give the organization the clearest understanding of people's performances, then it should be structured one way. If it's about keeping people motivated and engaged and excited about moving forward, then it should be structured in an entirely different way. But because we try to accomplish both at the same time, we actually are creating situations where we're asking managers to discourage performance. Managers will be forced to do things to demoralize people in the name of fulfilling the need of the performance management policy. So it's again, a lot of these things simply need to be deconstructed. We need to look at what is it that they're supposed to accomplish, and let's just let each individual initiative have its own execution. Because when we try to accomplish more than one thing at a time is when everything gets screwed up.
Yeah, Marcus Buckingham was brought into Deloitte, one of the big four, to revamp their annual performance. And there was a big HBR cover story on it. And it was really interesting. But let me ask you this. Ed and I, for 2 decades now, have been saying the best thing to get rid of the performance appraisal is to substitute it with after-action reviews like they do in the military. Phenomenal policy, shares learning, and actually improves future performance. That's what I think the annual performance appraisal is designed to do. But all the academic research says, if anything, it has a negative effect on future performance. What do you think about after-action reviews?
I'm a big fan. I'm actually, so with the Glinda Group right now, we are in beta with a product that encourages employees at the end of every week to capture their wins. And the reason that their real incentive to do it is that every Monday we send a template of the wins to the manager and say, select one win for each person, and then hit this button to send out a congratulations message. And so each week the team gets a message with highlighting one win from each team members, which is what keeps people excited to continue to share their wins. But when this happens, we start to build up an incredible database of like, hey, this is what the person is focused on and maybe what they're not focused on. And it'll give us a sense of where people are spending their time. And I feel like that kind of functionality should start to both provide real-time performance reviews and then even guidance, both individually and organizationally, about where can we start to shift our focus to be more aligned with the broader strategy.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm really intrigued by one of the effects of the after-action review, how we talk about the psychological safe space where you can admit mistakes. Well, if you watch like the Thunderbirds or the Blue Angels do AAR after an air show or something, they're really hard on themselves and they all help one another, and they're not worried about getting fired or getting a mark on their annual performance. I mean, it's just a safe place to recognize that this is a learning tool. We're trying to improve future performance. And I don't know, HR is the last people that get it, in my opinion.
Well, I think, again, my experience has been that I have way more empathy and compassion for HR practitioners than I do for HR as an institution, because it's most of the HR practitioners with whom I have worked over the course of my career are great and have their hands, and they're always just in the most impossible situations. And I've never seen a salesperson in an impossible situation, or a product person, or a customer success person. And no other job that I have ever seen has dueling priorities and conflicting archetypes anywhere in the organization. Only HR is burdened with this. And I think part of it is because people are the hardest things to deal with. They're very hard to define. And so somehow we decided, let's just take all people issues and throw them into one big unit, as though like people is a defining characteristic, when in fact it's infinite. So yeah, we could do a lot better simply by saying one part of HR is there for the employees, the other part of HR is there for the organization, and they are not the same people, nor are they the same job.
Yeah, I love that. It was a great way to frame it with the archetypes. They can't do both of these things. It's fantastic. Well, Jordan, this has flown by. Thank you so much for coming back. Hang with us as we go through a close. But Ed, what do we have coming up next week?
Next week, we are going to do our Woodard Roundtable with 3 folks from Woodard. It's going to be a deep dive on what they see in the profession and professions today. So
awesome. I'll see you in 167 hours.
This has been The Soul of Enterprise, Business in the Knowledge Economy. Sponsored by Woodard, building your ideal practice with coaching, education, community, and resources. Join us next week at 1 p.m. Eastern, or 3 p.m. Eastern, that's noon Pacific. In the meantime, please visit us on the web at www.thesoulofenterprise.com.